So on to the next panel, which I'm very excited about, and that is continuing processes from the 2020 election. And presenting today will be Monica Evans from Washington, D.C., Chris Piper from Virginia, and Todd Valentine from New York. And I believe that I will hand it over to Monica to kick us off.
Yes, good afternoon and thank you. And I have to also give a special thank you to Amy for driving because I'm technologically challenged and WebEx is not my friend. So thank you, Amy. Um, Before I begin my presentation, I'd just like to mention that DC Board of Elections is an independent DC government agency, and we essentially perform the functions of a state and local elections entity. So we are a little unique in the way that we operate. Next slide. So as we all know, we faced many challenges running the 2020 elections. And so I think the items on this slide are very familiar to most people. However, one thing that happened in 2020 that continues is the increased attention on elections and scrutiny of elections and elections operations. So it's always fun when someone who knows absolutely nothing about elections questions you and questions your ability to perform your job. Next slide. So for us, of course, everything changed on March 13th, 2020. Everything shut down and we had to largely scrap everything we had in place for our June 20 primary. Most people don't realize that election planning occurs long before election day. And one thing in particular on this slide, I'd just like to bring attention to, of course, in the midst of all of this, we did have implementation of new legislation, which was Restore the Vote legislation, which granted voting rights to incarcerated felons. And so in the midst of everything we were doing, we had to try to reach out to Federal Bureau of Prisons and register and get ballots to DC residents across the country in BOP facilities. Next slide. So we had to reimagine the 2020 election cycle. We had little time to plan before the primary, but we did what we could. And these are just some of the things that we started looking at. Next slide. So for the June primary, we were fortunate because we already had no excuse absentee voting in place. And so we had no issue with getting mail ballots to everyone. However, registered voters had to request an absentee ballot. And so that was a process we had to set up to ensure we had adequate phone resources and then the influx of mails mail that came in with those requesting an absentee ballot. So not a small feat by any means. Next slide. So in preparation for the primary, we essentially had to convert our warehouse into a mail house. And our warehouse is a warehouse in every way you can imagine. It is not plush. I think, Amy, you visited us in our warehouse location, so you know that it was very rustic, and we had to bring in 6-foot tables, and we had to essentially do everything from preparing mail packages, getting ballots in the mail, and typically in any given election cycle, we only process between 5,000 and 6,000 absentee ballots. By hand, we brought in temporary workers and we processed over 90,000 ballots for the primary election. Next slide. So in June, voters were able to vote, but there were challenges. So we did have long lines, and I think a lot of people experienced long lines during the primary. And a lot of our voters did not take advantage of early voting. And so that was a challenge. And then there were issues with communication. We were in the early phases of the pandemic and people did not get information the way they typically do. So people were not listening to the radio as they drove to work because they were working from home. And so we found that we had some challenges with our communication strategy with the June primary. And I'll just add in that 2 weeks after our June primary, we also had to conduct a special election for Ward 2. And in that election, we actually mailed a ballot to every resident and registered voter in Ward 2. So in addition to processing returns from the primary election between June 3rd and June 14th, we prepared and mailed another 40,000 ballots by hand out of our warehouse location. Next slide. So this is where we landed for the general election. You will see that we had more time, so we contracted with a mail house, K&H. Every voter received a ballot by mail. We opened vote centers, which were largely popular because you did not have to vote in your precinct location. You could vote in any one of 32 vote centers, including super vote centers. And then we had 95 vote centers open on election day. We also were able to procure and purchase 55 mail ballot drop boxes, and those were largely successful. And then in addition, ballots could also be deposited at any one of our 95 vote centers. And we had a major communications campaign. We revamped what we did for the primary, and that really worked. The one thing I will stress, none of this could have happened without additional funding. So we did have two private grants in addition to the CARES funding from the Election Assistance Commission. And that was the only way we made all of this happen for November. Next slide. So end of the day, we had a successful election. We received praise regarding the implementation of everything we did. And our former board chair is infamous for saying we threw everything in the kitchen sink at this election to make it work. And so voting by mail was the most popular method of voting in the general election. Of the ballots cast, 67% used mail ballots, and most did use the mail ballot drop boxes because there were concerns with the U.S. Postal Service. Next slide. So even though we had a successful election, we did not exhale right away. We immediately started seeking feedback. We held town hall meetings with voters and election workers. We really wanted to see how they viewed the things that we had done in the 2020 general election. And we were receiving positive press, but we really wanted some documentation to get a true evaluation of what happened in the election. So next slide. So we found out that voters liked mail ballots. They wanted us to continue the practice. They liked vote centers. They liked not having one location where they had to go and vote. And then they wanted us to continue the practice of mail ballot drop boxes. So all of this was positive and things that we really wanted to see continue. Next slide. So that set us up perfectly for the introduction of the Election Modernization Amendment Act of 2021. The council member responsible for our oversight actually introduced the legislation, and that legislation was introduced in 2021. And so it would really put a lot of the things that we saw in the 2020 election into permanent practice in the District of Columbia. So we do expect it to pass. We have testified at a hearing. This is effective for elections after the 22 election cycle. So this amendment is not in effect as of yet. Next slide. And because that the Election Modernization Act won't be in effect for the 2022 election cycle, we had to make adjustments. So for one, we did not have the funding for mail ballots. That cost is about $1 million as experienced in the 2020 election cycle. And so we had to actually go to the mayor, and we were fortunate enough to receive the money from the mayor's contingency fund to mail ballots to everyone in the primary election. And we have gone through and completed the contracting and procurement process. And once again, K&H was awarded that contract. So for the primary, once again, we are moving forward with vote centers, not precinct-based voting. And so we had to procure additional ballot on demand equipment so that voters did have the luxury and will have the luxury of voting in any vote center. We have also requested funding for the November general election, and the way our fiscal year runs, our general election will be in FY23, even though we are currently in FY22. So because we did receive money for the primary, we are hopeful we will also receive that funding for the general election in November. Next slide, please. So at this point, we are currently moving forward with the June primary, and we are enjoying the many successes that we had in 2020. Unfortunately, one of the practices we will not continue will be our super vote centers. We were fortunate enough to use National Stadium, Capital One Arena, even the Omni Hotel. And our super vote centers were largely successful. Everyone loved it. We even had the championship trophy from the Washington Nationals on display at that vote center. But of course, the facilities are not typically available. It was an anomaly to have those facilities vacant during an election cycle. So that is one thing that is out of our hands. Next slide. So even though we are absolutely enjoying its benefits without the passage of the act, with the Modernization Amendment Act, we will actually get funding. And so that's one of the huge benefits to actually having this legislation pass. And right now, it looks like we do have the support in the council for that to pass. And that's the end of my presentation, and happy to answer questions after the final panelist. Thank you.
Um, so, our story goes back a little bit further than 2020. So I have to go back a little bit further in time because our saga actually started a little before then. And I'll not dwell too long on these, but, we had a big change in the state itself after the 2018 election, where both houses and the governor all ended up in the same party. So at that point in time, legislation that had normally been not passed really started passing. So in just a few numbers, normally they have one or two changes in the law in a year. We had 52. And there were a few very large ones, and these occurred in January, where they moved our primary election all to June. We used to have a split primary because the legislature couldn't agree. So this was January. We're moving the primary from September and June all to June. We did start early voting. So they passed that early in 2019, and that was to start in the fall of 2019. We'd never had electronic poll books before. Those got stood up in less than 6 months, where we developed a program and did those. And we also added, because you had early voting, on-demand ballot printing, again, something we'd never had before. But to our legislature's credit, they did provide funding, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And then we did add online voter registration, and I should have put this in quotes, to start in 2021. That has not happened, and there's reasons for that. And then, but we did change our state as counties, as many states have. We made that if you move from county to county, you used to have to re-register, but now we made those moving between counties, which now required us to pass information between the counties. It ended up being a benefit in the future, but it was a different different change, a big change for us. And the party enrollment, many states have parties, and our enrollment change was critical for voting in a primary, was rather restrictive. If you wanted to say the June primary, you wanted to vote in that, you had to have changed your registration prior to the previous general election. And now we've changed it to the deadline is now Valentine's Day. Every year, it's on February 14th. Yay for me. But we also added a public campaign finance program, which is not scheduled to go into full effect until this year for the 24 election. It's not related to COVID, but it was one more thing the board had to do. And they drastically expanded our campaign disclosure requirements, because we have both the ballot access for statewide, but also all of the local campaign disclosures, which we review, and that takes a lot of staff. And Yeah, and just for fun, we decided to have a presidential primary in April. So in 2019, that was looking pretty good. Um, but then 2020, we started okay. You know, before COVID, we added a couple that would have an impact later on. Mandatory hand recounts. Of course, public campaign finance wasn't quite completed, so we decided to go a little further with that. And then this was the big thing is that we started to do, and we get into our COVID requirements, and I'll talk more about what survived, was allowing people to apply for an absentee ballot by what we later call the portal, electronic absentee application. And because we are still an excuse state, and I'll mention why we're still that in a little bit, but they redefined what, because you could get it if you were either away traveling or you were suffering an illness and you couldn't go out to vote. But they redefined illness to include, um, at that time, fear of getting COVID. It was done through an executive order, which I'll touch on in a second, but um, that is still with us. So we'll come back to that in a second. And then we did, for our early voting sites, we were tinkering with the where they should go, and we originally set it by a population number. You had to have so many sites per 50,000 voters, but then one county in particular decided they weren't going to put it in their most populous jurisdiction. That didn't fly with the legislature, so they now made it for everybody to have one, at least one in there. And another thing that's related to online voter registration is something we call automatic voter registration, which is a way for our NBRA agencies to now process electronic applications. Also supposed to go into effect in 2021, but we're going to see that's not quite going to come back. I'll only mention these quickly because and what's important here is the dates that these occurred on. Um, you know, so you see February, things are starting to happen, and then it really hits in March, and it starts with the original March 12th executive orders, and then you can see through March it was pretty much every other day, and we didn't necessarily know what the executive order was going to be until the governor announced it at that time, the former governor, during his Governor Cuomo's daily press conferences. So it was an interesting ride through the spring and into the summer, and then on through February the next year. And some were small, some were big. I still have a large stack of them. So, but they also did overlap some of the statute with the executive orders. We did at one time for the June of 20 primary, we, instead of sending out ballots, which our statute wouldn't allow because people had to apply, it mandated that we send out applications for everybody for the June primary, and then expanded how people could ask for them. And we made some adjustments to how people could get on the ballot. Now, this is for the June primary, and we were making changes starting in March for a ballot access period that was beginning in April. So just to give you a sense of everything was going on. And something that has continued to this day, beyond the executive orders, was allowing, because our parties do nominations for some of the small jurisdictions by just literally meeting, having a caucus and nominating people, but they allowed that to happen virtually. And like many people, it was unclear what was going on, so elections started to get postponed. We have a large number of, not only do we have counties, 58 of them, 62 if you count the 5 of New York City, but we also have about 1,500 villages, and not all of them have elections in March, but those got pushed down. The presidential primary got moved at first to a date undetermined, ultimately to June. We had some special elections. We had a congressional vacancy to fill, and then we had other assorted smaller districts that needed to be filled. Finally, they just gave up and canceled them altogether. Once we got to June, it was just too much. And then we get through the primary, August became interesting because now it was about how to conduct the general election during a COVID, during at the time height of COVID. We had to inform people about how to do, the days of hours of voting. County boards submitted a staffing plan to us. Not that we could do a lot with it, but at least we would have a sense of whether or not they were getting poll workers. Because just like Washington, DC, we were having trouble with getting poll workers in, and we did redesign our absentee ballot envelope. So that was in September, again, for ballots that were getting mailed out at the about the first week in October. So things were tight. September, we didn't have additional drop boxes, but we've always had in our statute that people could return absentee ballots to any poll site on election day. And since we already have 5,000 poll sites, we convinced the governor's office we didn't need any more. We had them everywhere. So that was helpful. And they did one little help to the poll workers, saved them a little on taxes. If they had worked and made too much, it might impact their unemployment for those who are out of work because of COVID. So that was helpful. So we get through the election. 20, like everybody else, you got through it. Not for us anyway, as a presidential election, it was uneventful. We were not necessarily a swing state, so that election was not crazy to us. But then 2021, the legislature's not done with stuff. So now over those couple of years, we're up to 100 different chapters. They were still making adjustments to ballot access and tinkering about election dates for some of our party offices because we were still concerned about a COVID election. But we did add some other things. And much like DC, we did a restoration of voting rights for parolees. That had already been in large measure in by an executive order for registration program. And we had a whole educational component, much like DC did. One of my favorite things was if you changed the poll site, you had to post notice on the old site, which we always had to do. But one legislature thought it was critical that it be on yellow paper, put it right in the law. So he never did. He thought, and I talked to him later, he said, yeah, that's so people could see it. I don't think they were going to miss it because there was nobody there, but he liked yellow paper. We made some changes about how you get off the ballot. One of the things that we have done, but still has not gone into effect, was our state website now will have to appear in the 12 most common languages. Still haven't done it yet. They extended the time to do that at one of the beginning chapters of this year. 3 chapters. I think we just had 2 more last week, so I think we're about 100. I think I might have missed a couple, about 108. And then, of course, we did adopt our new congressional and state legislative lines. There was a court challenge on that today. Probably won't change it much, but we're going to start with ballot access for June anyway. So what survived? The biggest thing for us was absentee voting. We are still an excuse state. It moved into law that we can do web-based absentee applications. So that has changed the dynamic of how people apply for those. We had to set a deadline of apply if you wanted it by mail. It used to be 7 days before the election, but with the delays in postal service, we're actually able to convince the legislature to move that deadline back. You can still apply in person after that. But we had to move that back because otherwise we would never be able to mail the ballot to people. And then we did change. We can receive your absentee ballot after election day, but it used to be postmarked the day before election. So now we changed it to election day. And if we get it the day after without a postmark, that's still good, recognizing there's no way you could not have mailed it before then. A big change that's going into effect this year is when we start counting absentee ballots, we're going to start counting those earlier, but not scanning them until early voting. We think that'll accelerate the results. This will be the first year we do it, so we'll see. And of course, early voting, even though we started that early, in 2019 in the fall election, again, the first year is never the biggest year. It picked up with the presidential year. It's getting to be more. So that's something that clearly is with us. They made some minor adjustments to, instead of the largest municipality is still there. We increased the number of sites that counties need to have, and also expanded some of the weekend hours. And of course, electronic poll books and on-demand ballot printing is still with us. Now, fortunately for us, we were able to make the case to the legislature that we needed funds for this. So back in 2019, when we first started early voting, they had given a grant for all of our counties, $10 million. We set up a base level amount for each county. You got $15,000 for every early voting poll site you set up in a county, to try to encourage them to do more than just the minimum. Kind of worked. And then we divided the rest among everybody else. So it ended up working out to be a pretty good program. That's the payments for that are ending or have ended. And we did the same thing with knowing that e-poll books were critical for early voting. We were able to fund that at the same time for $14 million. And that was, again, we set a base level for everybody. Here's what you're going to get at a minimum, and then we'll fund above that. And not to forget it, but we also were going with, from the 2020 election and prior, we set a grant amount for counties to increase their cybersecurity posture. So that was an initial grant program. And then the legislature continued with more money. We were very fortunate. We got because they made some adjustments to early voting and to help support it. These aren't permanent, they're grants, but at least it put every county in a base level to get where they needed to go. And then something we call the tier grant, which is what's ongoing now, was an additional money for the counties as well as for the state board to, if you have other upgrades, you see it's expanding. So again, we've divided that money among all the counties and kind of by the size of them. And things that we didn't do, just quickly, was they tried to pass amendments to the Constitution because that's where our excuse for absentee is. And we also have a 10-day minimum for registration. We had pushed it out to 25 days by legislature, but those both failed at the election, which was a little unexpected. So now they're trying to work on bills that might expand that or at least reduce the registration down. Our online voter registration, if you remember, I said we passed that back to go live in 2021. Well, that was, I'll call that a victim of COVID, because when we were about to get a vendor to help us put that in place, the state froze all spending, and we actually had to suspend all work for it for well over a year. So now we had to push that back into 2023. Absentee ballot tracking is something we're planning to go live in 2022. A lot of that's developed in-house. And we're going to continue with our public campaign finance. It's a big program. It'll be the largest one in the country once it's up and running. Hard to tell what the expense is going to be, but it is expanded our staff, which has led to the renovation and expansion of our office space. Which is something you would think would be easy, but not in New York. That's it's a fight. But we're making headway. And then I'm going to stop there because I'm kind of at my time.
All right. Hi, everybody. I know it's the end of a very long day and long 2 years, but we'll get through it. I'll talk a little bit about the Virginia story with regard to what we dealt with in during COVID, prior to COVID, after COVID, where we are now. There we go. So obviously, you know, I don't have to tell you all anything. The challenges that we had in 2020 started early and often. I was actually just laughing. I went to last week. I went to a restaurant that I had celebrated in after the Super Tuesday primary that we had. And it was the first time I'd been inside that restaurant in 2 years. And I was laughing because that was probably the easiest election I've ever run outside of special elections. We had the presidential primary, only one party. It was quick. We were actually in the restaurant by about an hour and a half after closing, after the polls closing. So that's how quick and easy it was. And then, of course, it didn't portend for the rest of the year. So we had a lot of issues that came up in 2020, but we were kind of pretty well set, better than we would have been had it come in a year earlier. So the legislature in 2020, prior to the pandemic, passed no excuse absentee voting, and actually created 45 days of early voting. And before we had to have, the voters had to have one of 23 excuses in order to vote. We did have online applications for absentee voting, but early voting had to be done with an excuse. To give you an idea of where we were in 2016, which is the highest number of absentee ballots that we'd ever processed here in Virginia. In 2016, we processed 566,000 absentee ballots. The rest of our turnout, the rest of our 4 million voter turnout was in person on election day. So this was already a huge step for us. We were in a good spot. What I can tell you real quick about the situation in Virginia is that legally you do still have to request an absentee ballot. So when the pandemic hit, we knew we weren't going to be able to mail out ballots without a change in our legislation or a change in our laws, or mail out applications, any of that stuff. It had to be requested either online or through the paper-based system. So I'm going to steal something. Judd actually was the first one I heard say this. I think he stole it from somebody, but I stole it from him. And I'll never forget this. Right after the pandemic hit, and people were asking, how in the world are we going to be able to pull off an election in November under these circumstances? And in our thinking, it was really about let's make sure that we make whatever way the voter wants to vote, make it safe and accessible. And so we had to think about that. We knew that early in-person was going to be accessible, or absentee by mail would be mostly accessible, at least requesting the ballot, because we had no excuse. We also had 45 days of in-person early voting, so individuals could come and do it of their choosing at a time that's convenient to them. But there were some other things that we needed to work out. And what we worked on, luckily the legislature came back into session in the summer, and they passed some budget amendments so that they could be in our Constitution. If you pass a law, even in a special session, it's not allowed to go take effect for 4 months after passage and signing by the governor. So the way they were able to get around that implementation was, or delay in implementation, was to pass these through the Appropriations Act. So we came up and said, if we're going to have safe voting, we're going to have to do something about our absentee process. We did not in 2020 have a cure process in place. So the legislature gave us the authority to, or gave the voter, I should say, the ability to cure their ballots should they be rejected for any reason. In Virginia, saying drop boxes is like a 4-letter word. So the legislation used the term drop-off locations. We were a lot more flexible with this legislation. Basically, we required a drop-off location at every general registrar's office, every in-person early voting center, and lastly, in every precinct. So we had to have a drop-off location in every one of those. If the registrar in the locality chose to have a drop-off location somewhere else in the locality, they were free to do that. They just had to have, maintain some very, very strict security protocols, which we drafted up in 2020. And many localities did utilize drop-off locations outside of those three other required ones. The other thing we did was expanded curbside voting. Prior to 2020, the only reason you could vote curbside is if you had a disability. It was expanded to anybody who, 65 or older or with a disability. The expansion of the term disability, pretty much anybody who was concerned about getting sick. And so now curbside voting is expanded beyond just the disabled and those over 65. I also added in here absentee reporting. I'll actually talk about that in a little bit. I mentioned, this is actually in the previous slide, and I apologize, I'm just jumping around, but we also had a court case in Virginia. The absentee ballot envelope is signed by the voter providing certain information, but it also has to be witnessed. Now, the witness does not have to be a registered voter, but there does have to be a witness sign on that, a signature on every absentee ballot. We had a court case brought to us in 2020 that actually removed that waiver, that witness signature requirement. So throughout 2020 into 2021, while there was still a state of emergency in Virginia, there was no requirement for a witness signature at all. Ballot pre-processing. It was always the law in Virginia, or has been the law for a number of years in Virginia, that allows a locality, if they wish, to pre-process ballots under the requirements of the law. It was not ever really utilized by most localities because there was never, 566,000 of 4 million votes in 2020 or 2016. There was never really a need. They were always able to process these pretty much on election day and report them out on election night. However, we knew that number was going to go way up, obviously, in 2020. So we started really recommending it, really pushing the localities to do it. The other thing that we wanted to do was make in-person voting on election day safe. So in previous conferences, I've talked about this, the Medical Reserve Corps. We worked with the Department of Health here in Virginia and the Medical Reserve Corps, which is a volunteer unit of folks in the medical professional field. They sign up and they're sent out to locations. And what we did was we partnered with them. We had Medical Reserve Corps hygiene ambassadors, essentially, who came to the polling places. They kept the polling places clean, wiping tables down, and also working to ensure social distancing, passing out masks if people weren't wearing a mask, those sorts of things. That was really, really helpful so that the election officers could actually focus on conducting the election in the polling place. So in 2021, General Assembly comes back. They codified the absentee cure process. They codified the drop-off location, as I mentioned, the expanded curbside voting. They've also, since then, I want to talk about the absentee reporting. So in Virginia, again, we always had like a central absentee precinct, and we didn't have a lot of votes in those, so it wasn't really a big deal. But then in 2020, obviously that number of absentee votes went through the roof. And so what we found is we're not breaking those back to or sending those back to the precincts. So last year, we made some changes in the way we reported it. But this year, in 2022, legislation is going through the General Assembly that is going to require us to report eventually, report all of our absentee ballots, in-person early voting ballots back to the precincts. It's something we just didn't have the ability to do prior to that. In 2021, the General Assembly also came back and they require localities to pre-process ballots. So it is in the law that that general registrars are required at least 7 days prior to the election to pre-process all of the ballots received to that point. And then they must continue to do so through election day, obviously. So now it is a requirement, not just a recommendation. And while it's not codified, but we continued to work with the Medical Reserve Corps and all the way through the last November election, we had MRC representatives in polling places across the Commonwealth. I'd also point out that the witness signature requirement, last year it was codified that if there's a state of emergency due to a communicable disease, then we must not require a witness signature. Then also part of that was they asked us to convene a work group. We convened a work group to come up with alternatives to the witness signature. We provided recommendations from that work group, and legislation regarding that is making its way through the General Assembly now. So witness signature is going the way of the dodo bird. All right. One of the other things we did in 2020, we really worked to make sure that those who were going to vote by mail had the ability to do so in a way that they were comfortable with. And that's when we required through a state board regulation that all envelopes include an intelligent mail barcode and that they have official election insignia. This was not a requirement prior to 2020, but this is was a big push to make sure that voters could track their ballots through the mail, and that the U.S. Post Office had easy recognition that they were dealing with official election mail. The other thing we got lucky to do is we wanted to make sure that we were working to build voter confidence. And so luckily we had some funding, a little bit of funding, to create a small voter education campaign in 2020. And I just real quick want to show the fruits of that labor with this, and hopefully it works. And Amy, I can see, is waiting in the wings. All right, here we go.
The founding story of this great country is also the story of Virginia, because the American ideals we cherish today were born right here. So democracy is more than just our way of life. It's the grand experiment we'll do everything we can to defend. At the Virginia Department of Elections, we believe the integrity of our democracy is bound by the integrity of our elections. Protecting our electoral process is what drives us. Defending against fraud and intrusion while ensuring that every vote is counted and every voice is heard. Because for Virginian, defending democracy through safe and secure elections isn't just patriotic, it's personal.
Okay, so I still get teary-eyed when I watch that. I was always very excited about that, but we actually used, I just remember we used 2018 HAVA funds for that, to build that commercial. But once we did it, you know, and we originally did it thinking about cybersecurity, but as 2020 ran on, we realized that what we had to do was create a campaign that that really focused on the fact that real people, your friends and neighbors, are running elections, not politicians per se. And so that was part of that, but it really definitely enlivened us to do something even bigger in 2021. Luckily, the General Assembly was supportive of that measure, And so we got some funding for that. We did a great little 2021 media campaign that included creating a Mythbusters website or election facts website with a lot of information in it. We also did print ads, radio ads, TV ads, obviously social media. And then, of course, we had op-eds that we published in papers around the Commonwealth. And you can see we've kept on that theme where we're looking and working with our friends and neighbors. So that was kind of, where we ended up after 2020. And 2021, it looks like we're going to continue on this path, not making major changes this year, just solidifying the work that we did in 2020 and again in 2021 going forward. So in honor of Women's History Month, I just wanted to provide this great quote from Barbara Jordan. The stakes are too high for government to be a spectator sport. And I want to thank everybody. And I want everybody to know that this is my email address for the next couple of weeks. If I didn't want to put my personal email on here. So please email me if you want to find me after this. I'm moving on. I'm going to join the good people at the elections group in April. So I'm pretty excited about that. And my member emeritus payment is in the mail. And of course, Amy, if you'll indulge me, it wouldn't be a NASED conference without my good friend and brother. If it comes up, why isn't it coming out? Ah, there we go. So I want to wish luck to Rob. Steve Trout pointed out to me that he is the last surviving member of the NASED Bald Caucus. Although, Rob, I've noticed in the boxes here that you've got a couple of potential new members of the caucus. So and Judd may be joining you soon enough. But anyway,
we're recruiting as we speak. We're recruiting.
But anyway, unfortunately, Steve wasn't in this picture. It was the first one I could find. But Jared is the team has moved on. But Bald Rob, you will represent us well, I'm sure. Anyway, thank you all very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chris, and all of our panelists. We have time now for some questions. So for the NASED members, you can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand, and we can move now. We have about 8 minutes for Q&A. I'll start for Chris. You mentioned that you, in 2020, I think, issued a regulation regarding IMBs and the election mail logo. Did you provide funding? Like, how did your localities afford that, and how will they continue affording that moving forward? Because I know, you have to work with a printer for that stuff.
Yeah, we worked to help them secure for the election mail insignia stamps because they already had their envelopes are because we passed that in I think August, so it was pretty late in the game. So they worked to get stamps, and that was how we got through 2020. And then we redesigned the envelopes anyway in 2021, so they had to purchase some new stock. As far as the IMBs, our system, our voter registration database, was already set up with that. So they could run the ballot envelopes through the printer and have that added on. So it wasn't an expense for them anyway. We had several localities that were already utilizing the IMBs. It's just that the regulation expanded it, required it for everybody.
Great. Do we have other questions?
And for anybody that's thinking about that kind of a regulation, a shout out to Tammy Patrick. She came and spoke to the board and made it real clear why that was such an important decision to make.
Other comments or questions for any of the panelists?
It must be 5 o'clock somewhere.
Well, Megan, with that, I will turn it back over to you to close us out.